Today we have Dr. Reginald Oduor here. He's from the University of Nairobi. He works on political philosophy, ethics, African philosophy, philosophy of religion. Today he's going to be talking about democracy in post-colonial Africa. And I want to also thank Reginald M.J, who pulled together this whole event and also got the political science department involved, so thanks to them too. Let's welcome our speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is good to be here today and to be able to talk to this very prestigious university. One of my compatriots was here for many years, Professor Atieno Odhiambo, and therefore it is an honor to be here. He died a few years ago, and some of you probably know him. Now today I'd like to talk about a model of democracy for post-colonial African states. And I'd like to start by giving you an outline of what I would like to look at. I'll start with some kind of introduction. And then I'll talk about the inadequacy of liberal democracy in the African context. And then I'll talk about the need to recognize ethnic identities and interests in Africa. And then I'll give a survey of the search for an African model of democracy. I'll then be more specific in the fifth section, giving outlines of an African model of democracy, and finally the conclusion. I would like to thank specifically Rainer Ebert for his efforts, together with Sophie Horowitz, for all the work that they have done towards this lecture. They have done a lot. They are very humble about it, but really this is their project and I'm most grateful to them. Now, let us go straight away to our introduction. Now, while liberal democracy is often considered to be a panacea for Africa's political instability, it is actually one of the main causes of this instability, being alien to Africa, having arisen out of the peculiar social, economic, and political developments in Western Europe. Yet post-colonial African states, most of which emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s, were established on liberal democratic constitutions that were soon put aside through military takeovers or subverted by civilian governments that in many cases established one-party dictatorships in their place. The continent-wide agitation for constitutional reforms, which gained momentum in the late 1980s, is evidence that the imposition of constitutions based on Western liberal democracy resulted in dysfunctional states. Now, this is something that is not so new. What I've made is not such new, it's nothing particularly new. But of even greater concern is the fact that the reintroduction of multi-party systems of government in several African countries from the early 1990s met with challenges very similar to the ones experienced at the dawn of political independence. This is mainly due to the fact that even the so-called second-generation constitutions that began to emerge in the continent in the 1990s have largely been grounded on a liberal democratic theoretical orientation. Thus, in the 1990s, newly elected governments were overthrown either through military coup d'etat, Sierra Leone, Burundi, Burundi and Cote d'Ivoire, or at the hands of armed guerrilla movements, Congo-Brazzaville. In other cases, adulterated multi-party elections resulted in the retention and legitimization of the continent's long-standing authoritarian civilian regimes, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, and my own country, Kenya. Even where there was a successful change of guard through credible multi-party elections, new, ostensibly democratic regimes quickly assumed an authoritarian character, typical of their predecessors, Zambia and Malawi. A few others remained aloof to these democratization initiatives, Sudan and Ethiopia. Now, in other words, the democratization that people were excited about in the early 1990s in Africa has added up to very little. Now, in the course of my doctoral thesis writing, I became acutely aware of the considerable agreement among several African political theorists that the so-called widespread failure of democracy in Africa is largely due to the fact that many post-colonial states in the continent inherited liberal models of democracy based on values that are alien to the communalistic outlook of the bulk of African populations. In particular, the one-person, one-vote characteristic of liberal democracy operates on the assumption that each individual votes on the basis of his or her own personal interests. For example, John Rawls is confident that his two principles of equal liberty and difference are sufficient for the creation of a just society, as together they promote a sense of self-respect in all citizens. However, in line with traditional Western liberal democracy, he assumes that the political actors in a democracy are individuals, no more and no less. His focus is on the freedom of citizens who find themselves as individuals at a disadvantage in society. Thus, Rawls does not see the need to cater for a minority view that is specific to a particular cultural group. So what we are basically saying is that liberal democracy is ethnically blind. It wants to treat people as individuals, and again, that is something that you are probably more familiar with than I am, because that this model of democracy was spawned in your sides, in your area, rather than in mine. Now, despite the liberal democratic emphasis on the atomic individual, the typical African voter's choice is significantly influenced by considerations of the good of his or her ethnic group rather than by his or her exclusive personal welfare. Consequently, some African scholars have intermittently pointed out that if a democratic culture is to take root in post-colonial African states, there is need to design new models of democracy that incorporate aspects of indigenous African political thought. And it is this literature that caught my attention and caused me to really think and look at this issue anew. Nevertheless, it is evident that due to the current modernizing and globalizing geopolitical realities, African communities cannot return to their pre-colonial political formations and must instead adapt to the demands of the post-colonial states in which they now live. In particular, they must temper their heavily communalistic orientation with respect for their members' right to dissociate themselves, partially or wholly, from the communal outlook in pursuit of their individually chosen aspirations. Consequently, my aim in this talk this evening is to propose the outlines of a communalistic model of democracy which synthesizes African and Western political thought in a manner that encourages more Africans to embrace a democratic culture. Towards this end, I seek to answer the following questions. I will be asking and seeking to answer the following questions. Number one, how could the values underpinning the indigenous governance systems of various African ethnic groups be utilized to design a model of democracy that facilitates greater ownership and participation by members of all ethnic groups in a post-colonial African state, thereby enhancing a democratic culture in its citizenry? And second, what values underpinning traditional Western liberal democratic theory can enhance the model of democracy referred to in the first question? So basically these are our two questions this evening, and I propose to go through my talk in a reasonably short time so that we can engage in a lot of discussion. Now, I'd like to focus for a while now on Western liberal democracy. Now, we are aware that this model of democracy is very, very strong on individual rights. And it sees human rights as the rights of the individual. But what I want to emphasize this evening, and I hope you will be patient with me, those of you who are enthusiasts of liberal democracy, is that liberal democracy is just one perspective among many. It is not the embodiment of democracy, but only one expression of it. And when the West seeks to impose it on the whole of the world, it actually engages in violence. It is not physical violence sometimes, but it violates the right to freedom of association when people in Africa are told, forget about your ethnic loyalties, just embrace democracy. And the talk is that tribalism, open quotes, close quotes, open inverted commas, close inverted commas, is the biggest problem in the democratization process in Africa. I will be seeking to convince you that that is not so. I will be seeking to convince you that it is the mismanagement of ethnic sentiment that has caused so much instability in the continent. Now, what is even more crucial is that Western liberal democracy, apart from the fact that it is only one perspective, it is in crisis even in the West, as I understand it. A crisis that has been there now for more than 100 years. Of course, in the 19th century, it was threatened by social democracy. It was threatened by Marxism. It was challenged. It was challenged by these two, which accused it of only offering formal freedom, the formal aspect of freedom, but not the substance of freedom, because it did not address the class struggles, it did not address inequality. Then, closer to our time, from the close of the last century, we started hearing other objections right here in the West again from those who sometimes call themselves communitarians, who have said, hey, liberal democracy has gone too far in its advocacy for this atomic individual, this Kantian being who is rational and determines his own choices by himself in total, perhaps disregard of all other people, except as far as the ethical considerations are concerned, but who really promotes his own welfare on the basis of his reason. That has been challenged by communitarianism. And we even have those who will not abandon liberalism, but will want to revise it. I'm thinking of somebody like Will Kimlicka from up north who actually argues that liberal democracy can accommodate group rights. And Multicultural Citizenship, his book of 1995, is very strong about this point. But there's another criticism that has been raised against liberal democracy, that it is not inclusive. That here in the West, for example, those who dominate the corridors of power are male, they are middle class, they are of European descent. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate is that even here in the West, you are being forced to revisit, to question the basics of the democratic model under which you operate. Of course, I could add another critique about the fact that the corporates have now acquired a lot of influence in your electioneering processes, with all their funding and so on, and all their lobbying, so that at the end of the day, one wonders, does your decision count as much as it should? And again, another criticism that has been leveled against liberal democracy, at least in the African context, is that Africa has not entered modernity in the way in which the West did. The West entered modernity through the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and of course the Renaissance before that and so on. But Africa entered modernity through a very violent process called colonialism, which, as I understand, is simply robbery with violence at the international level. We were swamped, and before we could figure out what we were, what all this was about, we were thrown into the deep end, as it were. And therefore, the way in which liberal democracy grew up in the West was a bit natural, was gradual. But for us, it came with a bang, and our former colonizers understand it while we don't, and yet insist we run with it. And I'll give you a very interesting one. The multi-party systems in Africa were quickly crushed by dictators. And some of the people in the West look and say, look at those Africans. They're such dictators. But you know what? There are those in Africa, political theorists, who will now insist that single-party dictatorships came about because of liberal democracy. Because, for example, the British system first passed the poll, the idea that whoever has more votes, even by a very small margin, takes over the reins of power. Now, what does that do? Those who lost are in the cold, because particularly the state has most of the resources, has control over a vast proportion of the resources in a post-colonial state. So those who lost elections start getting broke and feel like, you know what, let's cooperate with those who won. And that's how the multi-party system was killed, and the single-party system took over, and then the person who had his hands on the steering wheel kept ensuring that things worked to his or her advantage. It was usually his. So what we are saying is liberal democracy is even to blame for the single-party dictatorships that arose in Africa. In short, liberal democracy is not good for Africa. This is not a universal critique of liberal democracy. It is a critique of liberal democracy in the African context. And we have a scholar whom we greatly admire, a lot of us in Africa. He died long ago now, but we still admire him a lot. You may know him, you probably do, Frantz Fanon. And in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, he was urging Africans to think afresh about how they want their new states to be. And this is what he said. If we want to turn Africa into a new Europe, then let us leave the destiny of our countries to Europeans. They will know how to do it better than the most gifted among us. But if we want humanity to advance a step further, if we want to bring it up to a different level than that which Europe has shown it, then we must invent and we must make discoveries. That quotation inspires me to dare to think about an alternative model of democracy for post-colonial African states. So, I would like to talk very briefly about the search for an African model. Now, the search for an African model of democracy has been going on for quite a while. We have had, for example, African socialism very soon after political independence, with people like Nkrumah and Nyerere, who told us, we will take the communalistic outlook of our people before the advent of colonialism, and we will use it to design a model of governance that can strike resonance with our people and can catalyze the process of all-round development. Then we have a scholar called Mafeje, and he has proposed what he calls a new democracy. And in this new democracy model of his, he talks about three components. The model, the sovereignty of the people will be very important. Social justice that will ensure that people don't just have formal justice, formal rights, as in liberal democracy, but that their lives will actually be changed and there will be some kind of fairness in the distribution of what's available. And of course, and the third thing was about secured livelihood. It's very related to the second component, where he's saying people's lives should be secure in these African polities, whether they own property or not. I would think he's talking about some kind of social protection. But there are others who have suggested yet other models, so to speak. Like there are those who talk about going into our traditions, looking at our traditions, and taking from there certain elements that can enrich our contemporary democracies. In particular, I can think of one scholar called Wamala, who was really advocating for the monarchy. The monarchy, as was in the Baganda Kingdom. In the Baganda Kingdom in Uganda, there was a king. Now, it is very interesting that we have noticed that whenever democratization is spoken about in Africa, Africans are told, oh, forget about all your past and just embrace democracy. But when we look at Europe, that's not what they're doing. Look at the United Kingdom, for example. Is their democracy purely modern? No. They have the monarchy, they have royalty. And the royalty actually, I'm told, spends a lot of their taxes, and they are happy to have royalty spend their taxes. So much that when a new royalty is born, they are so excited. One more tax guzzler has come and we are happy. And yet nobody questions that Britain is a democracy, despite them having royalty. Royalty comes from what? The feudal days of yore, you know? But it is there in Britain today. And people are thrilled and people have dreams, and if any of them would be greeted by the Queen with her gloves, she would not wash her hands lest the little royalty she touched is washed away, you know? And we are amazed that that can go on in Europe and nobody raises an objection. But when we talk about royalty in Africa, forget about those traditional systems. We think there are double standards here. Now, there is another group of people proposing consensual democracy, where we abandon the majoritarian approach and we try to build consensus. We try to build agreement instead. One of the very famous African philosophers is Kwasi Wiredu. He's worked in this country for a long time, and he is one of the main advocates of consensual democracy. But then we have the same Wiredu advocating a no-party system. That goes hand in hand with consensual democracy, because he's saying parties institutionalize divergence of opinion. So instead of that, we can have a situation where the legislators seek to have consensus, and only where they are totally unable do they vote. But this no-party system has also been advocated by Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, and he will say he was very interested in democracy, but the way he has handled Ugandan elections makes us think otherwise. But in short, what I'm doing is to just give you a survey of some of the ideas that have been floated around as people are looking for an alternative model of democracy. But now, I left out a section here about the rationale for the principle of the recognition and protection of ethnic identities and interests in contemporary African democracies. What I am basically saying, and this is fundamental to being able to appreciate the model I'll be proposing, is that in Africa, people are very loyal to their ethnic groups. Now, that has been considered by many political theorists to be a problem. And as for me, I am saying that has never been a problem. The problem has been to try and operate as though that is not the case. If we operated with the fact of ethnic loyalty in mind, and if we undertook social engineering that factors it, there would have been no real problem. Let me give you an example. In many African countries, you get somebody winning political power, and then he starts to give all the plum jobs to people from his ethnic group. And when you ask him, why are you giving all the plum jobs to people from your ethnic group? He says, they belong to this nation and they are qualified. So stop thinking about them as belonging to this ethnic group or the other. So there is double speak, or there is duplicity, maybe the word. On the one hand, he says, we all belong to this, quote, nation, close quotes, because our countries are not even nations anymore. They are multinational states. But this talk about nationhood is another problem from liberal democracy in tradition. So he'll tell you, don't ask about their ethnicity. They all belong to this country. But you wonder, okay, so they all belong to this country, but so do people from other ethnic groups. And we are basically saying that what we need is to say we belong to different ethnic groups. Can we find a formula for sharing what's available instead of pretending that we are a homogeneous polity when we are not? That really is at the heart of what I am advocating for. And there is a quotation from a famous African theorist who has addressed this. His name is Claude Ake. I believe he's from Nigeria. And this is what he says. Ethnicity supposedly epitomizes backwardness and constrains the development of Africa. This presupposition is misleading, however, for it is development rather than the people and their culture which has to be problematized. Development has to begin by taking people and their culture as they are, not as they might be, and proceeding from there to define the problems and strategies for development. Otherwise, the problematic of development becomes a tautology. The people are not and cannot be a problem just by being what they are, even if part of what they are is ethnic consciousness. Our treatment of ethnicity and ethnic consciousness reflects this tendency to problematize the people and their culture, an error that continues to push Africa deeper into confusion. The point, of course, is not to romanticize the past and be captive to it, but to recognize what is on the ground and strive to engineer a more efficient, less traumatic, and less self-destructive social transformation. So basically, that is where I'm coming from. That the model of democracy that will ensure stability in Africa will be a model that actually is not shy about ethnicity, appreciates ethnicity and ethnic diversity, and incorporates that fact in all that happens, constitutional writing, legislation, and policy formulation. With that stated, we are ready to look at the outlines of my model. A model that I must say, if it is ever adopted, it is likely to be when I am nowhere here, because right now people are very stuck, though the power elites are very stuck with liberal democracy. But who knows, someday somebody might look up these kind of things that we say here and say, yes, let us finally try it out. So, what are the elements in my model? The first thing is ethnically based devolution or federalism. Right now, for example, in Kenya, we have devolution. The people at the grassroots are being given some power, being allowed to enjoy some decision making. But the formulators of our new constitution were firm that the devolution units must not be construed as ethnic territories. And in fact, some of the governors in some of the counties are being taken to task for employing too many people from the ethnic groups in the territory, the dominant ethnic groups in the territory. But that is taking us back to really the pretense of an ethnically blind polity. The pretense that it doesn't matter what ethnicity you come from. So I propose ethnically based devolution or federalism. The second thing I propose is recognition of indigenous systems of governance. I am thinking about in those territories, those units of devolution that ethnically based, they be allowed to exercise the governance system that makes sense to them, drawing from their traditions. And then I am proposing a synthetic two-chamber parliament. What I mean by that, you would understand easily if you look at the parliament of Somaliland. Not Somalia, but Somaliland. This is the secessionist unit that broke away from Somalia when it sank into disorder and chaos, because originally Somaliland was a British colony, and it voluntarily joined the Somali Republic. So when chaos broke out in Mogadishu, they thought, hey, we were not always here, why don't we leave? And now the United Nations won't let them leave, which is a very sad thing. But they have seceded, and they're running their lives, and they have a two-tiered parliament. The upper house is composed of elders respected in their clans. And the lower house is a typical Western type House of Representatives. One person, one vote kind of thing, producing it. What that does is to ensure that the lower house can conduct the affairs of a modern state. And the upper house can ensure that the cultural distinctives of the Somali people are not wiped away. And this is what I'm proposing as an appropriate way to run our affairs. After all, it would be very similar to the House of Lords, which in the British situation, people don't elect the House of Lords. I think there was something about they should be elected now, but I'm not sure it has come to pass. But the lower house, people are voted in. Now, I don't know whether they will go into elections there, but I wasn't planning to have them as our mentor. They have done us in long enough. They can go in peace or in pieces. But the point is, for us, we want to express. I think we should have space for the two-tiered parliament that then shows forth that synthesis of tradition and modernity. Now, this is another one, ethnically based shared executive power. Ethnically based shared executive power. Right now, in most African countries, the winner takes it all. And the winner belongs to one ethnic group, or at most it's a coalition of 2 or 3 in a country with maybe 50 or 40 or 60 ethnic groups. And so the others feel left in the cold. And this has really threatened the legitimacy of the state. So why not do it totally differently? Find a way to have an executive that is totally different from the type of executive you have in the West. An executive that is composed of more than one person, people from different ethnicities, and who therefore represent the interests of the different ethnic groups. Let me take the example of my country, Kenya, for example. We have 3 main types of cultures in the country. We have the agriculturalists, then we have the pastoralists, then we have the hunter-gatherers. And what has been happening is that some kind of hierarchy has developed where the agriculturalists have the upper hand, and state resources are used to support them heavily. Then the pastoralists have some kind of advantage. They still get something reasonable from the state. But the hunter-gatherers are being hunted out of their habitats, such as the Mau forest, and their culture is being destroyed. It is as though their culture is not important. And it is simply a numbers game, that the agriculturalists and the pastoralists are much more populous. And so they are really swamping the hunter-gatherers. But if there was an executive that has someone from the agriculturalist communities, someone from the pastoralist communities, and somebody from the hunter-gatherer communities, the lot of the hunter-gatherers would have been much better. So that's why I propose that. And the next thing is, I propose ethnically based parties and coalitions. Right now, we have ethnically based parties, but each of them pretends not to be ethnically based. Each of them says, we are a national party, but you know which party, for example, it belongs to the Luo if it's in Kenya, you know which one belongs to the Kikuyu, you know. But everybody's claiming, oh, we are just such lovely nationalists. That kind of pretense will be sorted out by just coming out clean and saying, hey, ethnic parties are ethnic parties. Right now, the law forbids ethnically based parties and therefore encourages hypocrisy. If we have ethnically based parties, but we have an opportunity for coalitions, we are likely to make much better, to have much more success in our political system. And then, ethnic equity in public appointments. Just the issue I was talking about earlier, about somebody takes power, hires mostly people from his or her ethnic group, and if he is asked, he says, oh, we are all Tanzanians, or we are all Nigerians, or we are all Kenyans, so don't look at ethnicity. But now we can have a situation where we judge the balance of appointments across the ethnicities, because that is likely to make people feel that they are part of the state. And then, the right to secession. You see, liberal democracy, for one, has always been averse to secession. I mean, you know how there was the Civil War here. I learned about that in 1978, long ago when I was in junior high, how there was such fighting here because one part wanted to secede. And I'm not saying that I support, I wasn't there and it is not quite where I come from, so I'm not taking sides in that one. But I'm saying in the African context, secession should be a constitutional right. Only that it shouldn't be made too easy to execute. The reason is, if it is there, it will motivate those in power to treat everybody well so that nobody can invoke it. But if they know that there is no provision for secession at all, then they are not encouraged to behave. And finally, liberal bills of rights. This is where the Western tradition becomes extremely handy. As I advocate the recognition of ethnic identity, I am acutely aware that ethnic communities can be great bullies. Great bullies, trying to force their members to only behave as the community dictates. And that is not to be tolerated. For example, if you have an ethnic group that insists on female genital mutilation, and you don't want it, there should be a Western-type Bill of Rights that protects you from the overbearing demands of your ethnic group. So that would then address a lot of the concerns that some of you will have by now from the kind of model that I'm proposing. It is not that liberal values are to be thrown out of Africa's window. It is that they are to find a place without violating the rights of people to ethnic identity. And so I come to my conclusion. Now, while there is much talk about the failure of democracy in Africa, I submit that democracy has not failed in the continent. Instead, what has repeatedly failed in Africa is liberal democracy. And this failure has been due to the imposition of this alien model onto post-colonial African polities without any regard for the distinctively communalistic and ethnically conscious political outlook of African people. It is therefore high time that African and Africanist political theorists got to work to utilize the rich indigenous African political heritage to develop a model of democracy that is in harmony with the totality of the African worldview. We will never manage to wish away the fact that when ethnic consciousness is ignored or castigated in the name of nation building, resentment develops among those who value their ethnic identities. In this regard, there is a scholar called Nara, and his quotation is right there, and it says, people invariably retain an attachment to their own ethnic group and the community in which they were brought up. There is an interdependence between the individual and collective processes of identity formation. Thus, individuals expect to recognize themselves in public institutions. They expect some consistency between their private identities and the symbolic contents upheld by public authorities, embedded in the social institutions and celebrated in public events. Otherwise, individuals feel like social strangers. They feel that the society is not their society. Thank you very much.